Good, I wanted to record this when the sun was out, so well. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Ankle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the new album from Plaid, Polymer. Plaid, that's Ed Handley and Andy Turner. I don't really have an elaborate intro for this long-running Warp Records mainstay duo. They're pretty well-known IDM legends. I did review their previous album, The Digging Remedy, back when that came out in 2016. I will link that video in the description. If you want my in-brief segment, it's in that video as well. Well, maybe not as accurate as it could have been, since their 2011 album, Scintillate, has its track listing screwed up on my iPod. It was screwed up. Made it less of a satisfying experience than it should have been, but I digress. Now, some people have compared Plaid to outfits like Outtaker in that they're constantly trying to be as weird as they can. But I've always felt that Plaid never truly lost that sense of accessibility or focus on melodies that Sean and Rob have basically completely abandoned at this point. Plaid's more like the lighthearted, quirky kind of weird, and exceptionally so. They've been putting out plenty of quality releases over the years. I think if you've never heard anything from these guys before, their debut album, Not for Threes, stands as unquestionably my favorite and what I believe to be the best jumping on point for them. Though any album from them could work as a jumping on point, honestly. Their Rest Proof Clockwork and Double Figure albums are also classics in my eyes and are certainly worth your time. And hell, The Digging Remedy still holds up as great to me now, if not even better than when I reviewed it. I do not have a CD of that one, though. Obviously, given these guys' status in the electronic music world, I was of course gonna have to cover this latest album. Though, I will admit this one kinda caught me off guard. Even if it has been 3 years since their last album, for whatever reason I wasn't actually expecting them to come out with a new project. It just kinda happened, and I was like, oh, cool, Plaid are back. So I picked this up. And I've intentionally been sitting on it for quite a while now, because Plaid are the epitome of a band you have to sit with for a long time and give lots and lots of repeat listens to get the most out of. Like, they're my number one go-to example of bands that require time to grow on you, but reap lots of rewards once you actually do. And Polymer is no exception. It took quite a lot of listens for me to have much of any verbalized opinion on this outside of, yep, this is in fact a Plaid album. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure if I've given it enough time even now, but I have sat down with it and processed it quite a bit, enough to put it in video form. So what do I think of it? Well, I don't think it's better than The Digging Remedy, but I do think it is really solid. I do actually think Polymer is a much more consistent album. Quality-wise, all the tracks are really close to each other, which is definitely not something you get out of every Plaid album. Like, I praised their 2014 album Ricci Prince for this too, but this is also far better than Ricci Prince, because from an instrumental standpoint, it's much more colorful and interesting, like Scintillate if the filler tracks were good too. But I think Digging Remedy just barely gets the edge for me over this one, though, because I think that was a much catchier album. Digging Remedy had 4 tracks that I can easily recall the tune to, even when something else is playing in the background or I have a different song stuck in my head. Those being Do Matter, Clock, You Mountain, and When. Nothing on Polymer really sticks in the head like those do for me, even after 7, 8 listens, or however many I've given it at this point. But I also looked back on the video I did on Digging Remedy, and I said the same thing about that album back then. Like I said then, even the standouts there aren't on the level of classic Plaid tracks like X-Torque or Iron. But I do not agree with that sentiment anymore. I now believe said standouts to, in fact, be up to the standards of the classic material. Easily. They've had real staying power that I could not have predicted at the time. So I'm absolutely open to the possibility of the exact same thing happening to Polymer. But the album's only been out for a week and a half, and I am not currently at that point. But this is still a really good album, and it's up to the usual quality standards you would hope for out of Plaid. It's kind of like their new Rest Proof Clockwork, sort of. So let's talk individual tracks. I'll just go through them in order, because why not? To begin with, the album definitely has an impactful opening with Med's Fade, and in some pretty dark and edgy territory, no less. Rough, raw, aggressive, dramatic, with big buzzing pads and screechy whistling sounds, and lots of humming, wordless female vocals adding to the mix, coming together in a hard-hitting groove that maybe even sounds a bit EBM influenced. That's one way to get your attention right off the bat. Maybe not the most indicative of openers, there's nothing else on the album that sounds like it. Maybe Recall, but even then, not really. But very few Plaid albums stick to one particular sound or style over the course of their whole running time. They've kinda outgrown the need for album openers to also serve as tone setters. That said, they do actually stick to some darker and more foreboding tones for at least a good handful of tracks. The offbeat and dissonant grooves and slashing acid stabs of the next track, Los, for instance, are similarly off-putting, if not quite as intense or personally gripping. Solid track, even if pretty consistently the one I personally found least interesting. Maru does bring in a lot of sparkly and refreshing melodic lines that feel much more on brand for them, but they don't even show up until you've gotten 2 full minutes of metallic clanking and vaguely unnerving subtle synth pads. That is definitely one of the most memorable moments from this thing. I was initially of the opinion that it took too long to get going to be a big highlight, but the melodies are definitely more satisfying thanks to having the 2-minute build-up behind them. Also worth mentioning that Orbital did a remix of this track that I personally enjoyed much more than the original, because of course I did. But it does kind of make me want to hear Plaid try remixing something from Monsters Exist. I do remember saying that that album had some Plaid-like qualities to it, so it would fit. Like this is an example, the next track, Ops, segue. It has a lot of these really breathy vocals that remind me of the weirdest parts of The End Is Nigh. Even if it builds into something quite different and more fast-paced, it doesn't have like a super epic slow burn chord progression, but the way it does progress is pretty cool and fits the dark and percussive tones of this particular section of the album. Drowned Sea is also quite dark and with lots of repetitive buzzing synth patterns. Doesn't seem that interesting at first, since it just kind of sticks to the same patterns over and over for most of it and doesn't really change them that much, but it really slowly builds up and gets more and more intense. And finally, 3.5 minutes in, pays off into this absolutely beautiful melodic outro that always caught my ear every time I put this on. After this, the tone does lighten up a bit as we move on to The Pale Moth, which not only has much more melodic focus across the board, but also features a lot of fast Spanish guitar plucking and clarinet breakdowns, and some little violins in the background near the end as well. By the way, I feel like the guy who plays all those instruments I just mentioned, Bennett Walsh, or however you say his name, this guy seriously deserves a big shout out. I don't think I'd be nearly as big of a Plaid fan as I am without his contributions to their albums over the years. Anyways, then you get what appears to be the big single from this thing, Dancers, got a music video and everything. And I kind of wish I had more to say about it, but it's a solid melodic cut. Nurula, though, that one was really nice. Brings in this really dreamy, nostalgic, and glistening vibe with more of Bennett Walsh's guitar playing, as well as layers of pianos and sparkly synth licks. Love the way that one sounds. Now, if for whatever reason you were frustrated at Plaid no longer really committing to the dark and percussive place where we started, I am not of that opinion. I like their more melodic stuff personally. But if you are of that opinion, they bring you right back into that dark sound with Recall. Now, I've seen some comparisons with this track and the kinds of sharp and aggressive instrumentals you'd see come out of an artist like Sophie. And yeah, I can definitely see that. It certainly bangs. There are lots of moments that just have this loud and visceral banging sound come crashing through all the various atonal buzzing sounds in the rest of the mix. Just the most percussive track in the bunch for sure. Maybe a bit repetitive to be a big highlight for me, but certainly a track that this album would be much worse off without. Then we get All to Get Her, a more melodic moment that also has quite a propulsive, if offbeat groove to it, albeit one that's much more openly inviting. It's hard to describe the vibe I get off this track. Like, I guess there's a bit of menace created in the bass lines, but the melodies kinda give it that typical quirky edge that almost makes it more cute or something. Like, it's menacing in the sense that a puppy growling at your neighbors is menacing. That's not a bad thing, though. Like, this was pretty consistently one of the most enjoyable moments on the album. It's very nice. Then you got another sparkly melodic moment in Dust, which, while good, wasn't among my personal favorites. Bordered on cloying on some listens and didn't come off that pleasant, but I can believe that was intentional. Thankfully, though, the album ends with two of the best tracks on here, if certainly much more lighthearted and melodic than the place where we started. You got the fast-paced and playful Crown Shy, which has a lot of focus on these accordion sounds provided by Gabriel Walsh. Not sure if he's related to Bennett Walsh, but whatever. There's a lot of guitars here too, and layers of plinking synth bleeps all over the place. It creates this really fun vibe that never fails to make me smile. And finally, they nail the closer as well with Praze, another quite acoustic-heavy number, not unlike the way Digging Remedy ended, albeit with a less melancholy tone than that album's closer when. Like, this one has layers upon layers of Welsh's guitar plinking of various timbres, presumably various different guitars. I think that he's credited as playing the mandolin in this one as well. There's some harpsichords and harps as well, because why not? This exact kind of, like, acoustic guitar heavy track with this kind of optimistic tone, this is the kind of stuff that I most love it when Plaid do. This kind of piece is just unmistakably their thing that I will always associate with them and them alone. So that's every track on Polymer, and yeah, I gotta say it's pretty airtight. Not to say I don't have my nitpicks, though. The whole plastic theme, while not badly executed, certainly I can see tying most of these tracks in the sense of plastic being this thing that we can't live with and can't live without. It works enough when I say it out loud like that, and you can tie in the darker and the lighter moods into an ambiguous concept like that. But, you know, this was never actually in the forefront of my mind while I was listening to it. I can see how the plastic theme could have inspired these pieces, but it's hardly like a concept album in which this theme was the main focus. It's also hard to justify this theme actually mattering much, especially when we just got that last Matmos album, which was about the exact same thing, but actually made that theme a tangible presence on the album that you could not possibly ignore, and was way more clever about it. But this wasn't something that actually made any impact on my enjoyment of the album. Because, I mean, Plaid albums have never had overarching themes to begin with. The album may not be all that cohesive from a sonic perspective, but Plaid albums really don't need to be. They've always delivered collections of tracks that are really highly varied and interesting and shift their mood all around. That is part of their appeal for me. I don't need them to be cohesive. I actually prefer more stylistically scattered albums like these from them. So long as they are doing it well, I am satisfied, and this album ticks all the boxes for things I want out of a Plaid album, outside of having big earworm-type standout tracks. Polymer may not be as cutting-edge to me as some people have made it out to be. It's nothing they haven't done before. But it's cutting edge in the same way that all Plaid albums are, in that no one else out there actually sounds like them. It kind of follows a set of sonic formulas that they've stuck to since the 90s, but again, that set of formulas is so multi-dimensional and varied and interesting that it never becomes an issue. Maybe I'm not crazy about every track on Polymer, and there were no huge standouts that just stuck out to me as among the best Plaid tracks I've ever heard, but I did definitely glean enjoyment out of every track on here, and I never felt compelled to skip around. And that is not something that Plaid have always succeeded in doing. And of course I was never bored, but I would also expect that out of Plaid. It would be a much greater anomaly for me to be bored by a Plaid album. And yeah, I guess that's all I got. In the end, Plaid continued to be Plaid on their latest album, and I'm on board for that. On Polymer, I'm overall feeling, I think this just skates by with a solid 8 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. There are some people you want to add yourself to that list or make me a review, something linked to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.